Israel, the Holy Land. Secrets of the past lie buried beneath the ground. American students are excavating an historic site. Supervising the dig, archaeologist Shimon Gibson.
Just move it back.
But when he takes the students to a cemetery near Jerusalem which dates back to the 1st century, they make a discovery. It will set the world of archaeology alight.
This is incredible. We're leaving on Saturdays, but Shimon thought it would be fun for us to go and find something fun to do for about an hour that wouldn't take much time. And so he said, well, hey, I know, let's go up to these tombs. And we come to this one tomb, and he's like, wow, you guys have got to come in here and see this. This is amazing. And then all of a sudden it's just an explosion of just excitement because Shimon comes across a 2,000-year-old shroud.
Has Shimon really found a 1st century shroud from the time of Jesus? The only one ever to have been discovered in Jerusalem?
Well, this was the most exciting moment of my life. I felt the tingling in my fingers. I thought to myself, if this is the real thing, wow, it's going to be sensational.
What would further investigation reveal about the tomb and its mysterious contents? A team of scientists is on the case. It will prove to be one of the most intriguing pieces of archaeological detective work in recent years. It draws us into the ongoing controversy surrounding the famous Shroud of Turin, which many believe was the cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus. It may even provide clues that could shed new light on the burial itself. Just south of Jerusalem's city walls is the Hinnom Valley, literally Hell Valley. It's an inhospitable place used as a dumping ground, home to snakes, scorpions, and the odd scavenging dog. On the southern side is a rocky limestone cliff pitted with tombs from the 1st century. It's well known to archaeologists like Shimon Gibson. He's been excavating the Holy Land for the past 25 years, but nothing was to prepare him for the chance discovery he made. It was something archaeologists can only dream of.
Well, this was one of those perfect moments when you're walking along a valley and then suddenly you come across something that you didn't know was there before.
What had attracted Shimon and the students to this tomb was a shattered fragment of an ossuary or bone box that was used to store ancient human remains. Tomb robbers had smashed the ossuaries, searching for treasure such as jewels and coins. But in a loculus, where bodies are laid to rest, the robbers missed what could turn out to be the most valuable treasure of all, the remains of a shroud.
I went into the tomb, which is difficult. You have to slide through the entrance. And then I looked around and I could see that there was an opening to a lower chamber. Of course, this got me very excited, and I descended to this next chamber. And then I noticed in one of the loculi what looked like bits of a greyish, blackish mud. And then I could see that these actually were remnants of a shroud.
No shroud had ever been found in any of 1,000 or so 1st century tombs excavated around Jerusalem. If this was indeed a shroud from that period, it would be unique.
I'm going to pass out number 3.
Here's number 4 coming in.
I actually don't need the top parts, I just need the lower parts when you give me. That's
The next hours were crucial. Under the cover of darkness, Shimon and his team had to work quickly to salvage the shroud remains. Not only was there a threat of the grave robbers returning, but an even greater threat from being seen by ultra-Orthodox Jews. They regard the excavation of ancient tombs as sacrilegious. They had crossed Shimon's path before. It had made the local news.
On one excavation, my team suffered incredibly at the hands of the ultra-Orthodox. Indeed, one of them was pushed in front of a bulldozer and she could have lost her life. And on another occasion, we were blocked up inside the tombs by the ultra-Orthodox who were demonstrating outside. And I was cursed. Posters were put up in the ultra-Orthodox quarter of Jerusalem, and the curse was that my hands would wither and drop off.
The ultra-Orthodox strictly adhere to Jewish religious law. When to rise, wash and pray, what food to eat. Each day is devoted to studying the scriptures and prayer. They have little or no contact with the world outside their community, yet they have become a powerful force in Israeli politics. They resent being photographed, but above all, they hate archaeologists disturbing the graves of their forefathers. This, they believe, will prevent the coming of the Messiah. One of the most passionate defenders of the ultra-Orthodox beliefs is Rabbi Porosh.
That is the most important for us in our belief not to touch a body after he's not alive. And with this you cannot discuss with me. Once I expressed myself, if you continue to touch bodies in this way which you are doing, blood will go shed in Israel.
It was now 8 hours since Shimon's discovery of the shroud. A lookout had been posted at the tomb entrance to keep watch.
We have plenty more outside also.
Okay. What I'm doing here is I'm actually taking out the fragments, putting them in boxes here, and we give them numbers so we'll know exactly what part of the body the fragments of shrouds came from. Where's the box?
So it's 12:45.
Yep, 42.
Wow.
There was an immediate problem. If left exposed to the atmosphere, the shroud pieces would deteriorate rapidly. So archaeologist Boaz Sizou from the Israel Antiquities Authority joined the salvage operation. He arranged for the shroud to be taken to the safety of a humidity-controlled room at the Jerusalem headquarters. Now, unless the shroud could be proved to be 1st century, it would have no impact on the story of Jesus' burial or the Turin shroud controversy. So Professor James Tabor, whose students were with Shimon when he found the shroud, took the next step.
The Israel Antiquities Authority authorized the export of some samples that could be tested at the University of Arizona. And I then, through my university, arranged to do a carbon-14 date.
The University of Arizona in Tucson has been radiocarbon dating archaeological finds since the mid-70s. Here they dated the Dead Sea Scrolls and another famous shroud that had captured the world's attention.
We also dated the Turin shroud, which some people thought might be the burial cloth of Jesus. And our measurements, and the measurement was also done at Oxford and in Zurich in Europe, and these measurements indicated that it was actually medieval, which was some disappointment.
So, was our shroud from the time of Jesus? Or would it too be a disappointment? This is how the radiocarbon dating technique works. Every living organism absorbs carbon-14 from the atmosphere. Once the organism dies, carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate. So, by measuring the amount of carbon left and comparing it to a modern reference, the age of the sample can be calculated.
If we have an old bone brought to us by an archaeologist, we extract the organic carbon from that bone and detect the carbon-14 in it. If it has half as much carbon-14 as a modern bone, then we know that it's been dead for one half-life of carbon-14, which is about 6,000 years.
It would be several weeks before the radiocarbon dating results reached Jerusalem. All the archaeologists could do now was wait. Shimon wanted to find out more about the tombs and the valley where he'd found the remains of the Shroud. The Hinnom Valley has a long association with death and burial. Even the ground itself seems to possess supernatural, mystical powers. A 12th century charnel house looms above the valley. It was built as a crematorium for the bodies of Christian soldiers and pilgrims who died during the Crusades.
There was a tradition that bodies deposited in the charnel house would rot rapidly within 24 hours, and the soil itself was taken away and seen to be quite holy.
But in the centuries before Christ, the valley served a more sinister purpose. It was a scene of ritual slaughter. Even babies and children were sacrificed to the pagan god Moloch, their corpses burned on the blood-soaked earth. By the 1st century AD, the valley had become a dumping ground. Among the garbage lay the bodies of common criminals.
In ancient times, they actually chucked the rubbish over the walls and down into the valley. So the rubbish would have accumulated on the slopes, and in the winter months, the rain would have washed that rubbish down into the valley itself. We know that there were tanneries around here and potter kilns. You've got to see here the lepers and other vagabonds moving around.
Hinnom is a Hebrew word, and in Greek it's translated as Gehenna, a place of continuing misery. It's from here we get our English word hell.
The references to hell in the New Testament are few, but they are actually to this geographical place, the Valley of Hinnom. You have Jesus a number of times referring to the end of the age and a judgment, which has led to all sorts of imaginations about a inferno below the earth with hot oil and melting rocks and various kinds of intriguing tortures.
Today there is still an air of foreboding. Even the local Palestinian children don't linger here on their way to school. Nabil grew up here. He remembers being warned about the evil spirits that haunted the place.
أنا انولدت في المنطقة هاي وكانت مدرستي قريبة من المنطقة هاي وكنا نروح على المدرسة.
After school, we used to come and play here. But when our fathers and grandfathers found out, they came to warn us that we shouldn't come, because this is called the hanging here.
فكنا نيجي نلعب.
This is where Judas hanged himself, and people are still afraid to pass this area after dark because of the bad spirit. And they believe in that thing.
Strange that Judas should be part of the local superstition, yet not so strange when, legend has it, Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, met a terrible death here in this valley. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Judas tried to return the 30 pieces of silver he was given to betray Christ, but the priests who'd paid him would not accept the blood money back. Instead, it was used to buy a plot of land. Judas hanged himself from one of the trees before his body was disemboweled on the rocks. From then on, it was called Akeldama, the field of blood.
Judas Iscariot, the betrayer of Jesus of Nazareth, is traditionally hanging himself and being buried in a field, And that seems to go well with the idea of being cast out and being thrown into a place of refuse. But on the other hand, we have along the bedrock slopes on the south of this whole valley these wonderful tombs that are clearly of the wealthy class during the 1st century AD.
The nobles, the aristocrats, the high priests, the rich people would have lived in the upper city. They would have been able to look across the Hinnom Valley at their cemeteries, and they could have located the tombs. They would have been able to protect them in terms of the place where they would ultimately be going.
Shimon wants to understand more about 1st century Jerusalem, the tomb, and the valley. He has ancient maps, drawings, and written sources, but what would really help the investigation would be to merge all this information together. So he's invited Aro Suderlund from the Helsinki University of Technology to join the team. Aro is an expert in ancient architecture and 3-dimensional graphic design. He has mapped out the precise locations as they were in the 1st century. To the west of the city is the palace of King Herod, where Jesus stood trial. As we sweep down the Hinnom Valley, we pass the red roofs of Mount Zion, home to Jerusalem's elite. We can see the demarcation between the living and the dead, the city walls and the exclusive burial grounds of the priests and the aristocracy. A short distance from the Shroud Cave is a tomb which has suffered less over the centuries. Here we get a real sense of what it was like to be wealthy 2,000 years ago. It belonged to a high priest who also played a part in the Easter story. The tomb of Annas is mentioned by the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus.
It's beautiful. Inside, the chambers are completely rock-cut. You have a beautiful ceiling, well executed in terms of the detail. And you also have on one side paneled false doors which may imitate the actual doors of the Jewish temple.
According to the Gospel of John, it was Annas who first interrogated Jesus after his arrest. An intriguing picture is beginning to emerge. Characters associated with the last days of Jesus Christ are coming alive as never before through the history and archaeology of Hell Valley. Just a few weeks after the Jerusalem Shroud was found, the University of Arizona had the result of the radiocarbon dating tests. So, was it a 1st century shroud?
We treated it more or less as all the other samples. We get sort of 5,000 samples per year run through the laboratory. And we got the result, and I reported it first over the telephone and then by letter. And when I talked to Professor Tabor over the telephone, I detected a certain amount of excitement in his voice when I told him that the cloth was 1st century.
I got this letter by fax first and just simply stared at it, immediately called my colleague Shimon Gibson, and we were quite ecstatic over these results. And then at the end of his letter, I'll read you what he wrote. Our friends from the Shroud of Turin days would certainly have appreciated a result like that one.
There was now no doubt that Shimon had actually discovered a burial shroud from the time of Jesus, with a carbon date fixing it to within the first 50 years of the century. There had been 1st century textiles found in Israel in dry areas like the Judean desert and the Dead Sea, but none in the highlands of Jerusalem.
We find textiles in very dry areas. I mean, for example, the Negev, the Arava, Judah desert. We don't find textiles in Jerusalem because it is too humid here.
So if it's too humid here, why had the shroud in the tomb been preserved?
It seems as if water was channeled beneath the loculus itself through a natural cleft in the rock. And because of that unusual circumstance, the shroud which was sealed inside this loculus was preserved, whereas the shrouds relating to the other human beings who were buried in the other loculi disintegrated completely. Now, it seems as if the tomb robbers actually had pulled open the stone door that blocked up the entrance to the loculus. They'd removed the plaster sealing the doorway itself in the process. This, of course, allowed for modern air to circulate within the tomb, and that really started the whole process of deterioration of the shroud, which had been there for 2,000 years.
Like Shimon, Aro Suderlund is no stranger to the dark, confined spaces of ancient tombs. Using maps, measurements and photographs, Aro begins to create a 3D computer image of the cemetery at Akeldama and our tomb as they were in the 1st century.
Yeah, there you have the crack now. I can show it. So I'll add the details from photographs. When I'm modeling these drawings, I'm putting them into action, so that plans and all sections, everything are joined together to form one truth only, the model.
Aro is in the unique position of being able to collate all the data and present it in a 3-dimensional form. This picture will be invaluable in understanding the tomb complex and its historical location.
I have marked all these cracks with the same color, so that we can follow it. We can also pick up the fractures to see how they go.
It's amazing.
Isn't it?
In fact, it's much better than the original image now that you've scanned it, and wow, it's great.
But if Shimon was to unravel the mystery of the tomb and its ancient contents, he would need more specialist help. Medical scientists at Jerusalem's famous Hadassah Hospital had already worked on other archaeological discoveries such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Shroud investigation needed their combined skills, so, for the first time, they came together as a dedicated team. The team leader is Professor Chuck Greenblatt.
We've built up a team of people interested in archaeology and evolutionary biology. We had Mark Spiegelman, who is a physician turned paleopathologist. Then Carney Matheson, a very fine student of DNA preservation. And finally, Azriel Gorski, a forensic scientist. So we had quite a team to bring to bear on this wonderful object of the shroud. If we take the shroud, it should be able to tell us whether it's plant or animal, and which plant or which animal. About the man, DNA is contained in his bones and his teeth. We ought to be able to tell something about, I should say, the person, his gender. We ought to be able to say something about where he came from. We may be able to even tell something about whether he falls into the priestly class or not.
Some of the hair from the head was still stuck to the shroud. It might reveal some valuable clue to the identity of the person. Azriel Gorski, the forensic scientist, is well used to detective work. For over 25 years he's been helping to solve countless murder cases. Now he has a 2,000-year-old mystery to investigate.
What we see here is we have broken hair fragments. There is no sign of disease that I can see. The hairs actually, when you look at them, have a sheen to them, which indicates that the hair was well kept and perhaps had been washed when at some period of time very close to death. There are some places where small cuts are seen, but most of the ends of the hairs are breaks. I see no sign of vermin remains such as lice cases. They seem to be hairs that I would expect from a person who had a healthy head of hair and took care of it.
In the 1st century, well-kept hair would be a strong indication that the person came from an affluent background, which is what we'd expect from someone buried in a Hinnom Valley tomb. And if the hair was washed close to death, does that mean it was part of the Jewish burial ritual? It may be a clue to what actually happened to Jesus' body before being placed in his tomb.
In the 1st century, the dead body was regarded as a massive source of impurity. As a result, the body had to be prepared for burial rites in a fashion which differed somewhat from the burial practices in other parts of the ancient world. First, the body was anointed with oil in order to make the flesh more flexible and also to be able to remove any impurities which were on the body. The body was set into an almost a vertical position, and then with water, the entire body was washed. Once the body had been washed, the body was ready to be enshrouded with either a linen sheet or a woolen garment. And then the body was taken to the tomb and inserted into the loculus for the final interment. This is a loculus. It's about 2 meters in length, so they could lay out a human being in a sort of burial state. In the 1st century, the common perception in the Jewish population was that a person who died, in our terms, was actually in a state of slumber. They were sleeping. They were brought to the tomb, they were placed in a loculus, and only after the body had decomposed, half a year later, or a year later, and their bones were gathered to be placed within an ossuary, where they actually were regarded as dead, no longer in a state of slumber.
The placing of the bones into an ossuary or bone box was called secondary burial. One question that was nagging Shimon was why the skeleton in the tomb was left beneath a shroud and not given secondary burial. Here was another tomb mystery. The burial was unfinished, just as in the Jesus story.
And sometimes patriarchs, important people within families, were left in their primary burial state, as opposed to other family members who were then gathered together. The bones were gathered and placed within ossuaries to allow room within these loculi for further burials.
About a meter and a half.
What does it look like in there?
Well, Shimon said there's a lot of bones in here. We've got a lot of fragments. Not too much to see.
Perhaps there was still another clue in the cave. Debbie Sklar is a physical anthropologist. She went to look for bone remains with DNA expert Connie Matheson.
Because of the poor state of preservation inside the cave, I had to rely mostly on the wear on the teeth.
This is a second molar, adult molar. It looks like it's from an individual about 20 to 30 years old. It's kind of hard to determine without the rest of the teeth. We've got the beginning of caries here on the corner, on the inside.
There were males and females in the tomb, children and infants. It seemed to be that the adults led a decent life in the fact that there were some individuals that were aged over 45, which is considered a long life when we're talking about these times.
Look at the size of that.
Oh, nice.
Oh, yeah.
The pathologies that we find sometimes that are left on the bones, they don't actually kill the people, but from the signs we can actually see what the individual went through during the course of their life.
Looks like a rib and really, really fine cranial fragment here. Definitely not the big fat male we had.
Oh yeah, that's an infant. It's as thin as an eggshell.
Because the bones in the shroud loculus were so badly deteriorated, Debbie was unable to tell if the person was male or female. For that, they would have to rely on DNA testing in the laboratory.
Here's the plaster up here.
Oh yeah. So this rock here would have covered it off?
Yeah, That's a ceiling stone.
She did find one human bone that was intact, but there was something unusual about it.
Got a little bit of bone.
The bone, which I recognized from the loculus of the shroud, displayed some strange pathology, which means that the outer surface of the bone looked very unhealthy.
What was the strange irregularity that Debbie had found in the bone? Some of the debris from the tomb had been taken away for examination by Egon Lass. His speciality is the separation of earth from other matter such as human remains. After spending hours examining bone and tooth fragments, he had a strange experience.
I was thinking that what you're doing here is you're picking through the bones of somebody who was once a human being. And this is what you will be when you die and when you've been in the ground for a long time. That's what's going to become of you. And after this began to work on me, other things began to work on me. It was as if the bones were starting to emanate some kind of vibration. Now, this is a ridiculous thing for a scientific person to say, but you really can't help these things happening when you're doing something like this. And I'm talking to you about a very personal experience. What the bones were vibrating into my consciousness was great pain and a lot of mourning. And it was not a happy experience for me to do this.
What Egon Lass did not know then was that the laboratory tests on the bones would confirm that the person beneath the shroud did indeed die in great pain. At Jerusalem's Hadassah Hospital, the team of scientists began to get results.
Are these sequences from the individuals in the cave of the shroud?
Dr. Carney Matheson had managed to extract DNA from the bones of the body under the shroud. Tests were done to identify the sex of the person. Males have an X and a Y chromosome.
You have to get the presence of the X and then the presence of the Y. And we had 3 results come up with the presence of the Y. And so we can be safe to say that it's male.
But what about the strange pathology?
We screened for a number of different types of pathologies, but the one that came up positive was tuberculosis, or the presence of Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA. So that was very interesting. But it was the lesion on the bone, which Debbie identified, that then led us into that search.
This was the same bone material that archaeologist Egon Lass had found so disturbing. The DNA showed that the body beneath the shroud had advanced tuberculosis. The victim would have indeed suffered great pain. The results were confirmed in London at University College Hospital by consultant Mark Spiegelman.
The White Plague, as it came to be known, causes you to bleed, you lose weight, you look terrible, and when you die a horrible death. His family would have been very distressed because it's not like a heart attack where you sit up and die. This would have taken weeks, and they'd have watched him waste away in front of their eyes and constantly see him cough up blood.
Does this explain why the family didn't go back and administer secondary burial, why the loculus had been sealed?
Perhaps the family members were scared. They didn't want to come into contact with this diseased person.
The other family members in the tomb had undergone secondary burial. On the floor of the cave were the shattered pieces of the ossuaries smashed by the tomb robbers.
Well, these ossuaries date from the 1st century AD. Extremely well carved, sometimes with excellent decorations on the sides. And all we're left with are these fragments. These stone ossuaries are about 1/2 meter, or about 1.5 feet in length. They're hand-carved, and you can see that some of them have been sawn. The sawing marks are very clear on this specific fragment. They have little feet sometimes to hold them at the bottom.
The ossuary pieces were carefully reassembled. Shimon knew from other Jewish family tombs of the time that some ossuaries had the deceased names inscribed on them.
But look at this one here. It's quite nice because you can see it's had this orange or yellow.
There were a number of inscriptions on these ossuaries. One was in Greek, reading Philo. The other three in Hebrew are Maria, which is Mary in English, Shalom, which is Salome in English, and Shalom Tzion is the third inscription.
It's through these personal details that the bones in the boxes become real people. Curiously, Mary and Salome were figures associated with the burial of Jesus, but these names were very common in his day. What about the fragments of the shroud itself? After 2,000 years, they had carbonized, but they still retained some of their original texture. At the Hadassah Hospital, forensic expert Azrael Gorski was continuing his search under the microscope.
We are dealing with a piece of cloth which is a one-to-one plain weave, and this is under, over, and under, and this way it's going under, over, over. And the distance between them is approximately 1 to 1. In other words, you've got as many in one direction as you do the other. The fibers are very, very badly degraded, but I see no indication of the flatness and the variations that I would see in flax. This much more matches wool. I cannot say that it's wool specifically, but everything I've done would lead me to the impression that it is wool.
So if our first century shroud was made of wool and not of flax-based linen, does this tell us something about the status of the person it covered?
Usually shrouds were made of linen, so this again is another indication that this was a person of some standing. Who could this person be? Well, it's difficult to tell. An aristocrat? A high priest?
Woolen garments are associated with the aristocratic high priesthood of the time. It's no coincidence that our body was found in a tomb almost adjacent to that of the high priest Annas, who, you'll remember, interrogated Jesus after his arrest. At the Israel Antiquities Authority, Orit Shamir, an expert on ancient textiles, was able to tell much more.
In the beginning, I was not sure if it is a shroud or a tunic or a mantle or a piece of a garment, but then I realized that all the pieces of textile are from the same cloth. The wool is very delicate and there are no faults of weaving. The textile is in very good condition. I mean, there isn't any holes and there isn't any mending.
Some first-century textiles had survived in the arid desert areas of Israel, but they were all made using a common type of plain weave. What was significant about our shroud was that the wool had been spun in the opposite direction.
This spin direction can teach us that those textiles came from Greece or from Italy, because we don't find this kind of spinning in Israel. I assume they came from the high-level population of Israel because it was expensive to import wool from Greece or from Italy.
Shimon and his team now knew that the shroud was wool, with a common type of plain weave, and the material was imported. It wrapped the body of a wealthy man, possibly a priest. How does this new information relate to the famous Shroud of Turin? When it was radiocarbon dated, the test showed it to be 14th century. Even so, there are still people who believe it is the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ.
There certainly are people who dispute our findings on the Shroud of Turin, and our answer to that is that the measurement is still correct.
Now we have a known Jerusalem shroud from the time of Christ to compare it with. Orit Shamir has followed the controversy surrounding the Turin shroud.
The Shroud of Turin is made of linen. We have here a textile which is made of wool, so we can see some of the differences to the Shroud of Turin.
Orit has been given a replica sample of the Turin shroud material.
The Shroud of Turin is made of more complicated technique, which we don't find this technique in Israel in the 1st century CE. This textile is made of plain weave. I mean, this is very simple weave, and the Shroud of Turin is made of twill 3-on-1, which is more complicated than our shroud. I don't believe that the Shroud of Turin belonged to the 1st century CE.
On the evidence of the only shroud from 1st century Jerusalem, it is now difficult to accept that the Shroud of Turin was the burial cloth of Jesus. The traders and tourists in Jerusalem's old city are unaware of the remarkable discovery of the shroud and the tomb. It is just another day. For them, the Hinnom Valley is a rubbish dump, not on any tour guide's itinerary. The focal point for pilgrims here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most important site for Christians. Under this one roof is Golgotha, the traditional site of Jesus' crucifixion and his burial tomb. The church now stands within the old city itself, but at the time of the crucifixion, Golgotha was a quarry outside the city walls. After the crucifixion, a mysterious character emerges in the Jesus story. His name is Joseph of Arimathea, and like Annas, the high priest, and Judas the betrayer, he too played a part in the Easter story. Joseph may have been a secret follower of Jesus, but all the Gospels agree he was a man of wealth and status.
He's influential. He can go to Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, and ask for the body. He's rich and he's sympathetic. And so taking those three attributes, he takes the body and puts it in this rock-hewn tomb nearby. One of the Gospels, Matthew, even says that it's his own tomb. See, this was on a Friday afternoon, but it was a double Sabbath. It was also the Passover coming that night. And so the rush to get this corpse off the cross and get it buried is running through all the Gospels, this sense that it's got to be done quickly. So here Jesus, who says he has no place to lay his head, at the end is put in a place that only the wealthy could afford. We can't say exactly where the tomb of Jesus was. The traditional site at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is certainly a possibility. But if we're trying to imagine what it was like, and you've got to come to a place like this, and then I think the gospel stories just come alive. So Jesus was buried, according to all of our evidence, in tombs very much like these in this area, and very much like the tomb in which this shroud was discovered.
There is no direct archaeological evidence or historical tradition linking Joseph of Arimathea to the Hinnom Valley. But being a man of means, he would have owned a tomb in one of the prestigious cemeteries that surrounded Jerusalem. The Hinnom Valley is one possibility. Some speculation could be made about a possible connection between the location of Jesus' tomb and the Hinnom Valley, Hell Valley. From the earliest times, Christian tradition and legend have maintained that between his death and resurrection, Christ descended into hell or Hades to bring salvation to captive souls. Is it possible that this tradition is somehow related to him being buried in Hell Valley? Aro Söderlund has completed his three-dimensional reconstruction of the tomb itself.
It's there. Yeah.
Disappeared behind
And the gates will be there.
He now has a unique visual record of what it would have looked like at the time of the burial.
It's quite possible that this person was around in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, perhaps even bumping into Jesus himself. We can't really know. I mean, that's sheer speculation, but it's an entertaining thought.
Since the man in the shroud was buried near the tomb of Annas the high priest, Shimon feels that he too was most likely a Jewish priest of some standing. He might well have officiated at the Jewish temple. He might have walked on these very steps which led to the main gates. He may have encountered Jesus, the troublesome Galilean, condemned as King of the Jews. He may even have been part of the conspiracy that resulted in his crucifixion. What had started out as a last-minute student excursion has led to a unique archaeological discovery and a tantalizing detective story. From the scant remains of a piece of ancient fabric has come evidence that further undermines the claim that the Turin shroud is the cloth that wrapped Jesus' body. No one can be certain as to the precise location of Jesus' tomb, but our investigation has unearthed information which gives a new significance to the Hinnom Valley and adds further to the mystery surrounding his burial site.
For those who approach the New Testament more from the angle of faith, I suppose these discoveries raise the question for them of the faith not simply being made up out of thin air, but it rests upon some sort of historical foundation. That is, Jesus did exist, he was buried in a tomb. The tombs are somewhat like this. And it's a wonderful juxtaposition between scientific studies, DNA and archaeology and carbon dating, and reading a text that people consider to be the most sacred text on earth. That fitting together is seldom something that you see in religious traditions and science.
Here's a piece where you can really see internal structure.
Yet this new alliance of archaeology and science may be too late for the Hinnom Valley tombs. Each day, the developers' bulldozers draw closer. More construction is underway, and a new sewer pipe is being laid through Hell Valley, right to the entrances of the tombs themselves. It won't stop archaeologists like Shimon Gibson continuing their passionate search into the past. The investigation into the shroud and the tomb continues. But other remaining secrets of Hell Valley may be incarcerated in concrete forever.